Hello again. It's me. It's Miranda. And as you can probably guess by this strategically placed psychology-infused book, today it's story time. I'm going to be telling you the story of how I got onto the clinical psychology doctorate, talking to you about the work experience and academic qualifications that I clocked up along the way. Now, why am I picking this story for story time, I hear you ask? Well, because there is no set path to getting onto the doctorate, and I think it's important to highlight that there are many different routes that you can take. As the old, very violent saying goes, there is more than one way to skin a cat. So hopefully hearing some of these case studies will give you a little bit of confidence to pick a path that suits you. So let's get right into it with chapter 1 of the story. So I like to call this part of my life peaking, or the alternative title, the genesis of my ego. So I grew up and went to school in London, and I did very well in my GCSEs in A-levels, like very well. This is relevant to the story, by the way, I'm not just like And so after that I went and did my undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of Bristol. Again, did very well. Like grades, tests, all of that, very much my thing. I think what I didn't realise is that during this process I was developing a very warped approach to education / life in general. I was very concerned with getting results and much less preoccupied with the actual act of learning and developing. Because of this, my self-esteem was also super wrapped up with the idea of success, and I think I'd unwittingly developed this belief that because things had gone well for me so far, that work and school-related stuff would always come kind of easily to me, which, looking back on, I'm just like...
You serious?
Yeah. So I started applying for jobs and I got nothing. Nada. Absolutely zilch. Trust me when I say that I did not get a single interview for anything. I think part of the problem was that I was almost exclusively looking at assistant psychologist and research assistant jobs, thinking that these were the entry-level rungs onto the career ladder, when actually, more often than not, I feel like people get these positions after getting a little bit of experience under their belt or doing a master's, and I had done neither. Anyway, this was absolutely earth-shattering for me. Like, I don't want to be too nasty to my younger self, but now that I'm grown, I feel like I can look back and say that there was definitely a degree of, I can't believe people aren't noticing me. Do they know who I am? That fantastic entitlement that really blossoms in your teens and early 20s. My ego seriously could not handle the rejection, and instead of ploughing on in steadfast commitment to following my dreams, I bailed. I actually can remember telling people at the time that psychology just really isn't for me, anyway. And I think it was only after 2 or 3 months of looking for a job that I completely abandoned psychology and started looking elsewhere. In fairness to me, I was running out of money fast, and I absolutely, at the time, could not support myself through a very elongated job search. But either way, I was out of psychology, which leads me on to the next chapter, which I like to call, what the hell am I doing here? So, where did I end up after I petulantly gave up on psychology? I got a job in IT recruitment. Yes. Seriously. And that is no disrespect to the job itself. I genuinely did learn a lot from working in that environment, and I super admire the work ethic of people who work in sales. But come on, what the hell? Like, I am a super introverted soul, to the point that when I'm getting a takeaway, I will get my other half to call up the restaurant on my behalf, because I cannot bear the idea of talking to strangers on the phone. And I got a job that was centered around talking to strangers on the phone. Fantastic. It might surprise you to hear that I actually stayed in that job for an entire year. I think at the beginning I was very caught up in the excitement of actually having a job and working with loads of people who were my age, and suddenly we all had a salary, and so it was very much like after all that excitement had worn off, I realised that I was very, very deeply not suited to that role whatsoever. Like, the fear and anxiety that I would feel before going into work the next day became really overwhelming, and it got to the point where I just couldn't take it anymore. So one day, I pulled the plug without having anything lined up. I like to call this chapter of my life Going Rogue and a Chance Encounter. At this stage, I wasn't 100% sure that I wanted to return to psychology because I was very much still a woman scorned, but I definitely wanted a change, so I decided to dip my toe back into the waters. I had learned a thing or two from the last time round, so I decided to widen my job search a little bit, and in the end, I landed a position working as a teaching assistant at a school for children with autism. Now, I really enjoyed this job. I was matched with a wonderful class, and I was paired with a teacher who was fantastic. But I think as the weeks and months progressed, my role became a lot more centered around behavioral management, and I think that just gave me a nice reminder that I did much prefer the psychological approach to things. So after maybe 3 months, I started back on the job hunt again. Despite having a year of irrelevant experience, I was actually getting a lot more traction with my applications this time round. But this is where my stroke of luck happened. I heard through the grapevine that there was a clinical psychologist somewhere in the team at the school, and that the assistant psychologist role had recently been vacated. So through a little bit of shimmying and shaking, I managed to get my CV in front of the clinical psychologist before it was advertised, which if any of you have applied for an AP role, you'll know that is gold dust. This led to the next chapter, which I like to call Finding My Righteous Path and Getting Busy. So it turned out that the clinical psychologist who was working at the school also had her own private practice, and she was also looking for an assistant psychologist to join her team. And she was telling me about how in her working week she worked with several different clients, and for me, variety is very much the spice of life. So when she offered me a job with her, I very gladly accepted. This job was the bulk of my work experience, and I actually ended up staying with her all the way up to me getting onto the doctorate. So that was around 3 years in total. To break down the job a little bit, so I worked at the school for children with autism, I worked at 2 residential care homes for girls, and I also supported my supervisor to do medico-legal work. So the types of things that I got experience of included working with people one-to-one, conducting groups, doing some teaching and training, and doing some testing type stuff. And after a year of doing this, I was like, I must get on to the doctorate. So I started to get very busy, and I put the feelers out to see if there were any side projects that I could take on to complement the work that I was doing as an AP within the private practice that I was working in. I think here I took a much more creative approach to finding new positions. So I actually approached a CBT therapist directly at my local IAP service to see if I could volunteer with her, and that actually came through. And the second thing I did was connecting to groups that were relevant to me. So I got onto the mailing list for the King's Aspiring Psychologist role, and every now and then they send around job opportunities. And I found little bits of research work that I could pick up and sort of fit around my working week. So I ended up doing some kind of testing and administration stuff for UCL and Oxford Brookes. With all of that under my belt, bubbling and percolating in the background, I decided to apply for the doctorate for the first time, but didn't get on. And this led to my final stage of life. Oh, that makes it sound like I've died. So this led on to the final chapter before getting onto the doctorate, which I like to call actually learning something. I say this being a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I obviously learn a lot from my work experience, but I think what this first rejection showed me was that I was still very much in this mentality of
Results above all else.
And this was super problematic for me because for the vast majority of us, the road to the doctorate is going to be littered with failures and disappointment, and putting so much value on success meant that I actually lost a lot of confidence in myself along the way and found the application itself beyond stressful. My lack of confidence really came across in my writing, and later the one interview that I got that year, which is just like, oh, painful memories. But anyway, I needed it. It was important because it showed me that it was my mentality getting in my way. I had all the necessary requirements, work experience and academic wise, that I needed at that point. It was just my confidence that was letting me down. So this phase, which is one I'm still very much going through, by the way, was much more about internal change. So as you well know, my work experience stayed the same, but I started to view myself more as a learner and became less obsessed with this idea of being the finished article. And this approach was so refreshing for my mind. Like, it no longer felt like I had this like angry, aggressive person breathing down my neck who would just be ready to scream at me anytime I did something that was less than perfect. Instead, I felt like I could be a little less uptight and more myself. So with this transformation in tow, I applied for the doctorate a second time, and this time got a handful of interviews and finally got accepted onto the course. Now, this story of me getting onto the doctorate really wouldn't be complete without this final chapter, which I will just call driving. So being from London, I hadn't learned to drive, and yet when I applied for the doctorate, I picked a course where I needed a driving license to interview. And classic me, being stupid, I kind of assumed I wouldn't get an interview. And I didn't bother starting my lessons until I got the offer, which meant I had 1 month to go from complete beginner to passing my test. And so ensued the most stressful month of my life. It was utter chaos. But after failing the practical test once, I managed to get it in just in the nick of time. Whew. After that, I am driving a little bit, but I don't think any of it really prepared me for the 4 to 5 hour car journey that I had to undertake to move myself for the course. So my parents don't drive and my brother had a broken foot at this point, so it was really genuinely up to me to get myself there. So I'm thinking I'll just leave at 4 in the morning. It'll be really quiet, so this means that I won't crash the car. What do? I crash the car. Nobody was hurt, the car was really quite fine, I was able to drive off straight away, but I was a little shaken up and I was still about an hour away from my destination. And I'm with my other half who also does not drive. Like, why do I surround myself with people who don't drive? So I spent the next hour just silently crying behind my wheel, looking a little bit like... Talk about a dramatic start to doctorate life. Now that we have come to the end of the story, I'm going to leave you with just a few take-home messages. There really is a moral to every story, and I think now that I've shared my story with you, I put together a don't stress list. So these are things that I do not want you to worry about if they also feature in your story. So this includes having a relevant experience, needing to do a career change, not having a master's, having very limited research experience, and working with just one client group. I've also put together my little recommendations list. The first one being, don't get too caught up in grades and this idea of having to be perfect. I feel like that's so important for me to say because I think psychology, especially clinical psychology, seems to attract so many perfectionists and people who are super, super hard on themselves and want to excel and achieve in everything. Please take the pressure off yourself and just allow yourself a little bit of breathing room to just play around and be free and just take all the learning that you can take from whatever work opportunity that you're in at the moment. And I suppose my final recommendation would be just don't try to learn how to drive in 1 month. It's really stressful. Don't do it. Please. Okay. Right, I will leave it there. So next week I'm going to be talking to you about my first year, so answering some questions and giving you my honest review of starting the clinical psychology doctorate. So really looking forward to speaking to you then. Ciao for now. And this was problematic for me because for the vast... Ooh. And this... God, shut up. I would also say that it could be quite nice to consider... Okay.